All right, welcome everyone. I have Alicia Hammond with me. Today's International Women's Day, it's March 8th, 2021, and women are still underpaid, and that should not be. And that's why we are here to discuss Alicia's research and work from the World Bank 2020 report, The Equality Equation. Why? Alicia Hammond is a gender specialist at the World Bank Group, where she leads on innovation and technology for the gender group. She conducts research on women and girls in STEM and advises on the design of innovative projects focused on enhancing digital skills and facilitating women's economic opportunities through technology. Couldn't be a more powerful combination, Alicia. So, welcome and thank you to all for joining. Alicia, let's start with your story. You are from Jamaica. Tell us, what was it like for growing up for you, and how did you get interested in such an important topic?
Thank you so much, Tara. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. So thanks for having me. I always feel like this question is a tough one, right? Trying to pinpoint exactly where in your life you got interested in certain things. And so I've been spending a lot of time reflecting, and a couple points in time come up for me. I was a really shy child. I don't know if you would believe it now. Very quiet and very observant. And I think, one of the things that struck me early on was just how gender roles function in households and in the broader society. And so, even in my household growing up, we had pretty rigid gender norms and rules. I was responsible for trying to do the cooking. My brother had to do the trash, like I mean, perhaps in other households as well. And I remember, spending a lot of time questioning this and challenging it. And later on, my parents actually, separated, and this is always a complex time, I think, for kids. But interestingly, then I saw my mom subvert those social and gender norms in a pretty radical way. And I think that also gave me the space to figure out who I was outside of that context as well, right? And so, norms do change. My brother is a pretty good cook now. He actually owns a restaurant. So, it's always nice to kind of see that transition. But the second thing, I think about a lot when it comes to STEM in particular, is I was really good at physics as a kid growing up. I really wanted to be a physicist. Later on, when I went to boarding school, one of my best friends and I, Chelsea, we were like top in the class in AP physics. And I entered college. I went to a women's college, Mount Holyoke, and I wanted to be a physicist. And so I had my first advanced calc class, and it crushed me. It was pretty brutal. I think I got a B minus or something like that. And I was completely discouraged, and I ended up switching to the humanities. And, that's in a context where I'm in a women's college and I don't have those, rigid stereotypes around me kind of reinforcing these negative messages. And even then I kind of fell into that same pattern. And it wasn't until later on doing this research that I came to learn that this is actually very common. And this is a point in time, where it presents an opportunity for kind of intervention, right, to help keep young women on the pathway. So, I think that gives me some impetus now to kind of think through, okay, how do we figure out what works, and just open the pathways for everyone so that we don't discourage ourselves and we can pursue a wider range of careers.
Thanks for sharing that story, Liz. Yeah. I think there's also something to do with age when you develop some maturity and you're like, the world doesn't tell me what to do.
Absolutely.
Right. And I hope girls can get that young. You don't need to be 40 to get that, and lots of life experience.
Yeah. And honestly, I love what I do now. I think, I picked a different path, and there's a part of me that's very creative, and, I don't have any regrets for that. That's very fulfilling. But I think it's about, how do we clear the pathways and the barriers so that everybody can, if you're interested, you can pursue that pathway and go deeper. Exactly.
So let's talk about the report and the awesome research that. So does your report say that girls are smarter than boys, do better in math, do better in science, but for some crazy reason they do not take up careers in engineering and technology? And what did you find?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start by telling you what we were trying to do. So, we started this research a couple of years ago as a larger part of a World Bank initiative within our group at the Gender Group to figure out what works for women's work. And so we started to look at STEM as a broader part of occupational sex segregation. And one of our goals was to focus on low and middle income contexts because, of course, we're the World Bank and that's where we work. And then we also wanted to look at the life cycle, right? So figuring out what happens along the pathway with girls and then young women through education and all the way into the labor market. And so we reviewed about 300 papers, done roughly in the last 10 years. And, what we found was interesting. I think we all know that girls are equally capable as boys. And in many cases, they actually perform better, particularly in science and sometimes in math, right? Often in math. But there's no systematic advantage for boys in these subjects. And so even though that's the case, and we have more women in university as well, fewer women pursue STEM, particularly engineering and computer science and physics. And so, when we looked at the research, what we found was actually there's this huge ecosystem of stereotypes. And they start early. For example, they start in the home when it comes to parental expectations about what your children, what path your children pursue. Of course, in the classroom with teachers, but of course, learning materials as well, where men are more likely to be portrayed as scientists. We see it in the media as well as the wider culture. And there's this really interesting implicit association test research that showed I think it was, I can't remember the number, but maybe 500,000 people or something. And what they found was that 70% of people associated men with science. And so that gives you some insight in terms of like how deeply ingrained these norms and gender kind of stereotypes are in our society. And that can really have an impact, right? We see that it can have an impact in terms of girls' interests, aspiration, and often confidence in these fields.
Yeah, I mean, I think I run little like clubs everywhere, and it's always interesting. Parents come to me and say, these are 10-year-old, 8-year-old, 11-year-old. Mm-hmm. She's just not interested in this. And I'm like, just give her the option. Maybe if you ask her, she's going to say no, but invite her in. And as they start to do it, they love it, right? It's just that stereotypes, even for peers, is so strong, right? Like this is not something, these are big barriers to fight.
Yeah, and also the hands-on approach, right? I think, which is a lot of what Technovation does, which is awesome, right? So essentially, giving this hands-on experience to work with technology to solve problems you care about, and that really changes the perception of technology for girls. So I think it's really
an identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can dig a little bit into this because this is such a fascinating and nuanced problem. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, I read this work by a professor. I think she's at UC Santa Barbara. Her name is Professor Maria Charles, and she was very curious how come girls in rich countries do not pursue STEM careers. And her finding was that as you have more money, you are really very vulnerable to media, and media is constantly saying, buy this to make you happy, do this to make you happy, you are amazing, and you follow your passions. And turns out our passions are things that are result in like short-term happiness, right? Which is easy, maybe not like hard work that makes you sort of struggle, but is more fulfilling in the end. And so what happens is you end up following things that are not STEM related. So did you find similar things, or I think your report found similar findings, but builds on this?
Yeah, I find this really interesting. So a couple other researchers, including I think it's Stowett and Gary, have looked into this issue, and it's kind of coined the gender equality paradox. And so what they find is often cases in higher income countries that are considered more gender equal, we actually find fewer women in STEM. And so, we took kind of this concept and we wanted to look at other metrics of what would be considered gender equal. And so we tested out against a couple of different tools. And so we have something at the World Bank called the Women, Business and the Law tool. And they actually have a new report that just came out, and that looks at differences in gender equality in the law. We have a couple others. I think the UN has one, the OECD, all different kinds of indices related to gender equality. And we actually found the same relationship. And I think, one of the kind of the hypotheses was that in countries that, this might be a path to economic security for women in countries that, are perhaps in lower resource settings. And so I think it's complicated because, you mentioned the role of of media. And of course, media is really influential in setting norms. And, for me, I'm not against following your passion, right? but it kind of doing some deeper thinking into exploring, what shapes your passion. And I think, of course, we see that the role of the media is critical there. And it's really hard to disentangle what is a social norm versus what is an individual preference. So it's a little bit tricky. But I think my personal philosophy on this is, it's about creating an enabling environment that removes these barriers for everyone, because we need everyone. We need the poets and the engineers and the novelists and the technologists. And so I think it's about how do we create these, a more equal society that's free of these norms. And then we have a wider range of people pursuing their interests and having a wider range of passions as well.
I think that's the heart of sustainable development, right? Mm-hmm. Like where everybody gets to thrive, and so does the planet. So Alicia, I think your report was the first report where I found mapping international data for women in STEM, because we're very familiar with the data in the US, also Europe. But it was so interesting to read about the Republic of Korea and Argentina, where you have many women researchers, but they don't go into the private sector. So that was absolutely fascinating. So tell us some more about that.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is a lot of STEM research is really dominated by what's coming out of US and Europe. And so we need, much more research from a wider range of contexts. But when we look regionally and globally, we see some interesting variations. So for example, in the Middle East, they're up to, I think, depending on the metric you use, up to 60% of women who study STEM. In my region, that figure is pretty high, almost 40%, I think almost 50% in Europe and Central Asia. So you see a lot of variation across the world. But kind of going back to the Middle East, because I find that it's a really interesting context to look at when it comes to STEM, because you have a high share of women who study STEM. When women study STEM, they don't always enter the labor market. When they do enter the labor market, they don't always work in the private sector, right? And so, I remember a couple of years ago when I was in Tunisia and talking to an incredible group of women technologists and women in STEM. And, what they shared was really interesting, right? It's around the social norms. It's around access to care. It's about, the discrimination that you might face when you do enter the labor market. But another thing they raised, which I don't think we talk about, or I don't hear about a lot, is, thinking through how we link STEM to entrepreneurship in a better way, right? So, one of the things I remember they said to us was, what we really need is stronger linkages to the startup ecosystem, like help us commercialize the STEM solutions that we already have come up with, and give us the tools to build our own businesses, right? So I think, that's a critical entry point for us as well, particularly where we have a lot of women in STEM in certain regions. How can we actually better support them in a wider range of ways?
That's interesting. So what are some findings from countries in Africa and that education organizations should know and think about and prepare students towards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, we don't have a ton of data that's coming out. But, we do have some kind of individual level studies that kind of show some of the interesting, reflect the findings that we find in other places as well, right? So particularly when we're thinking about bias in the classroom, we found one study from Zimbabwe that really showed this. And it was really about teacher-initiated contact, going more to boys, and teachers really raising the issue of marriage to girls more often than perhaps career goals or outcomes. But at the same time, I think what we see in the Africa region is a lot of exciting good practices and a lot of exciting research, right? And so one of the things I think about a lot is just the startup ecosystems that are popping up everywhere, right? Like in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. And, what's really exciting about these is, really having the space to develop local solutions related to technology for local problems, right? So not just kind of transplanting what we see in Silicon Valley, which I think is really important. The second thing I want to share, the World Bank supports a couple great initiatives, and one is focused on women in STEM. It's called African Centers for Excellence, and that has a focus on women in STEM. And so they graduated their first cohort of PhD scientists recently, and they're working on a wide range of applied sciences issues, climate change, agriculture, some related to health. So I think it's exciting that, if we really show the support structurally, like thinking of things like scholarships and, supporting women in that area, I think that's something that, is very promising. And then the second area I wanted to share is around the research. So we have a program at the World Bank called the Africa Gender Innovation Lab, and they have some really good research focused on, figuring out what works to get women into male-dominated spaces. And some of the research shows that male role models are particularly important. And I think this is interesting because for STEM, the research is a lot about female role models, but in other male-dominated spaces, these studies really show the importance of male role models. So, really thinking through, how we leverage both in what we're trying to do. And then the second was about just information. And what I find really interesting is they gave the information in terms of, salary potential of different streams. And that was really effective in helping to switch women into more male-dominated spaces. So I think, we can take a couple of these insights from interventions and try and scale them up in a lot of other countries as well.
Yeah,
around Africa. Yeah.
And I think that's the power of this, right? Like where that's why we wanted to do this series, so that we can quickly hear what is working and then deploy it. These are things that are tangible and concrete. So the report talks about, of course, stereotypes being this huge barrier, and they're in affecting self-efficacy for girls. But it's also very hard to measure this, right? And it's very easy to measure coding video views and say that, okay, we reach so many people. So what is your recommendation for how education organizations should measure change in attitude, especially around these sense of self-efficacy for girls?
Yeah, self-efficacy is a tough one, right? Because it's kind of a messy concept. It changes over time. It might change according to the situation that you're in. I could feel really confident doing one thing and, maybe less confident doing another. So I think what we see is a lot of complex concepts around self-efficacy. And I think some of the things that are important are, one, it's not always linked to performance. So you might not feel confident, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to do great in this area, which particularly it stems some STEM performance studies. So I think that's also really interesting. But the other thing is that there are things that are more important, like science identity. Like how strongly do you feel about one, the fact that you want to pursue STEM in some sort of way, and how strongly do you feel about your identity as a potential scientist? And those are a lot more effective and much more reliable than self-efficacy. But I think in terms of what we can do, there are a couple of things. I really loved reading about growth mindset, and I try and adapt it to my own life, right? And so this idea is that, not that you have to be, it's not like these skills are innate, but most things can be developed over time with practice, right? And I think that's so important, and has a lot to do with kind of perseverance and persistence in these areas. And the second one we started to talk about before, but is role models, right? This idea of representation and seeing yourself reflected is really, really, really powerful when it comes to STEM. And of course, like I said, what you do, a lot about the hands-on experience, right? So it's not just about this theoretical study of STEM, but actually how you can apply it to things you care about in your own life. But, one of the other things I wanted to say as well is, when we focus on women in STEM, we focus so much on the women and so much on the girls, which in one part is going to be important, right? But it's also about this broader ecosystem that we exist in, and working through the stereotypes and biases there. So I think we kind of have to take a wider view and approach those issues as well.
That's important, Alicia, and I think that's something that Technovation can do better, where we have been measuring self-efficacy, content knowledge, but I think the identity part is a little bit trickier, because it takes a little bit of time to build that identity, right? So you have to stick with the girl and the family for a long period of time. So it's a test of the organization. But I feel like, okay, it's 2021. We're still talking about this problem. We got to do some things differently, right? Otherwise, it'll be 2025. We'll be still talking about this problem. So
and you make a good point, right? It's about how programs are structured. And so if we want to kind of have this long-term engagement, how do we actually reframe and restructure how we work on these issues?
Yeah, because on one hand, funders are saying, stay focused. This is called mission creep if you sort of change your age. But guess what? We still have this problem of not having enough women in STEM. So something is not working, right? So like you say, broaden the view and think about it as a long-term challenge, because ideas change. So you mentioned the implicit association test, and I was reading Mazarin Banerjee, who's one of the researchers behind it. They did a survey with 4 million Americans recently in 2019 and found that attitudes in American society, really like anti-gay, anti-Black, anti-dark skin, have changed towards not from negative to neutral. And roughly sort of the implicit attitudes about sexual orientation have changed the fastest, with anti-gay bias decreasing by more than 30% over a 10-year period. And so I think I can say that even in my life, like I've seen these attitudes change very fast, and it's hopeful. And not that fast, because it still took a long time, but we need to do the same for gender stereotypes and gender biases. So what is your advice for education organizations to tackle this, keeping in mind that we are capable of changing our minds about things?
Yeah, I think this is a great kind of exploration of strategy and how we can apply it to other contexts, because I think there's some good research out there that shows the role of the media was really important, right? And so it kind of created this cyclical effect where, you saw more gay people in the media, more people came out, and then it was, you know more LGBTQ people in real life, and that started to change the norms that we see in society. And I think we can kind of, adapt that, and that links to the role model effect as well. And it links to what we do in kind of on the media side when it comes to women and girls in STEM. One thing I get really excited about when I read about it is a Scully effect from X-Files, and how, they, I forget the size of the study, but they, surveyed young women, and what they found was, I think Scully was 50% reported that Scully helped to increase their interest in STEM. So, we think about things like that, and, it's really innovative. And I don't know if the creators of X-Files went into it with that intention, but look at the impact, which I think is really cool. But I think when we talk about education organizations, there are a couple of other things we can do. I think this issue of biases in learning materials is really, really critical. And there was this one great example from Zimbabwe where the students were helping to identify the biases in their own textbooks. And then they got a group of female writers to come in, rewrite some of the content, and profile women who have entered male-dominated spaces and have done really well. And 7 out of 10 girls shifted their aspirations to male-dominated spaces after that. So thinking through, okay, these materials that we read are really impactful, and paying attention to them and reframing them and updating them so that they don't reflect these regressive gender stereotypes, I think is super critical. I think the second thing we see in the research is norms do change. There's some good research around just engaging boys in the discussion of norms in the classroom, discussions around gender equality, and that helped to increase the participation of boys in household chores, and that was in Haryana in India. And of course, the role of soap operas in Brazil, that's linked to fertility rates, but I think that's been a great example as well. And then some good research out of Nigeria linked to MTV, and that helping to shift the norms around testing when it comes to HIV/AIDS. But the other thing, I was reading a study recently, and this is not STEM related, but I found it really interesting. It was about, looking at how we shift social norms in relation to intimate partner violence. And this study was from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so they engaged men and men-only groups for, I think, over the course of 4 months, talking about gender roles and social norms and just these concepts of power. And what's interesting is that, that helped to increase men's participation in the household, in the housework. It helped to reduce the severity and frequency of violence, but it did not eliminate violence. And fundamentally, what it showed was that men were not willing to give up power. And so I think we have to think about power in this as a concept in a really interesting way, where, I think engaging those who have power is one part of the equation, but it's not enough, right? It's more of a passive approach. We have to think about how we kind of increase our power in our own ways as well.
That's fascinating. I think I'm going to ask you this question, Alicia, later, but the previous person I interviewed for Field Notes last week, Teresa Drew, she mentioned the book to read that I haven't read is Power by Naomi Alderman. So I want to read that.
Oh, I have to write that down too.
I know, right? I think that's very, very relevant. So what is one story that warmed your heart last year?
Yeah, last year is a tough year, I think, for everybody. So finding these moments of joy is really, really important. But I remember during the Technovation World Summit, you had an awesome keynote speaker, Jasmine Moglebi. I have to make sure I pronounce her last name properly, but a really, amazing NASA astronaut. And I remember her telling her story about her experiences at MIT and, entering her first math class, and there was kind of the standard one and the more advanced one, and she's like, no, I got this. I'm going to do like the really hard one, and ended up getting 24% on the first exam, and then still struggling in different ways throughout. And her message was, if it's important to you, you're going to fail along the way, right? And so really kind of, sticking with what you believe in, sticking with what your vision, and knowing that, it's not about being perfect at the get-go, but kind of connecting to what you believe in and the change you want to make, and having that pull you through. So that inspired me a lot. I kind of took notes on my phone and I go back to them every time I'm feeling, a little bit discouraged. And, I think she also talked about about fulfilling your potential, right? And just thinking about it in that way as well. So that stayed with me. It still stays with me. So that was awesome. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah, I'm glad. I think everybody had that same. They're like, no way, like an astronaut. That's the beginnings, and it's not easy. So Alicia, what is one book we should read to be better human beings?
I always tell you this. I don't know if I am in any place to tell anyone how to be a better human being. But I think one book I'm enjoying right now is called Algorithms, if you can say it, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. It's by Sophia Umojo Noble. So I think that's really important to read when we start to talk about algorithms, data discrimination, and the potential effect on people of color, particularly in this case, Black women. So I recommend that book.
Alicia, I won't be able to keep up because last time you said race after technology, and I was like, okay, Alicia, I have my book here.
Oh, you got it.
Like, okay, it's not gonna work.
I read multiple at once. I'm kind of that terrible. I know. It's like, some people are like, we have to finish this. I kind of read 3 at a time. So
I agree. Last question. What should we be working on with intention this year?
I'm a big fan of meditation. I don't do it as often as I would like to, but I think it's something you can't do too often, and you always feel much better when you spend some time doing that. So I think, I think things have gotten so fast. I think we're all online, spending basically our entire lives online, reading or doing homework or working in general. And I think finding some space and time for quiet is really important. So I recommend meditation.
Yeah, I have a dog. I walk the dog, and that's my meditative space. You need it, otherwise life is too noisy.
Yeah, walking meditation, that counts too.
Thank you. Anyway, Alicia, thank you so much. That was such a deep and thoughtful discussion. Thank you for sharing all your research, all your the work that you're seeing, but there's a lot that education organizations can do. I think the barriers are big, but we know so much, and we just got to reframe our goals. And it's 2021, and I hope next year we don't have this conversation, because I hope we make a lot more progress. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and see you later this week.
And thank you, Tara. Thanks for everything you do for women and girls around the world.
We have to.